Martha lived alone on the hill, her small farmhouse a lonely speck against the wide, windswept sky. It wasn't always this way. Laughter used to echo through the rooms, and strong arms would help her with the planting. But that was before Thomas, before the sickness took him too soon. Now only the wind whispered her name. Her farm was her life, a patch of green clinging to the hillside. She knew every inch of the soil, the way it warmed in the spring sun, the way it turned to stubborn clay after a hard rain. But the weather was a constant worry. The hill was exposed, vulnerable. Summers could parch the earth, leaving her crops withered and brown. Winters brought biting winds and heavy snows that threatened to bury everything. Every sunrise, Martha would step onto her porch and study the sky. She could read the clouds like a book, predicting rain or sunshine with uncanny accuracy. A halo around the moon meant storms were brewing. Red skies at night meant calm sailing for the morning. She knew the language of the wind, the rustle of the leaves, the creak of the old oak tree in the yard. They all spoke of the weather, a constant conversation that filled the silence of her solitary life. The land was both a blessing and a curse. It provided her with food and a purpose, but it also demanded constant vigilance. She spent her days tending her garden, weeding and watering, always mindful of the changing conditions. The soil beneath her fingernails was a testament to her hard work, a connection to the earth that grounded her. But the hill was unforgiving. One wrong move, one unexpected storm, and everything could be swept away. The fear of that loss was a weight she carried with her always, a shadow that stretched long across her fields. She hoarded dry firewood, checked the storm shutters, and prayed for gentle seasons, always knowing that the weather held her fate in its unpredictable hands. The storm began subtly, a low grumble on the horizon like a giant clearing its throat. Martha, ever watchful, recognized the signs. The wind picked up, swirling leaves into miniature tornadoes across her yard. The sky darkened, turning from a hopeful blue to a bruised purple. She hurried to secure the last of her garden tools, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. This was no ordinary rain shower, this was something fierce. Soon the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the windows like tiny fists. Then the heavens opened. The rain came down in sheets, blurring the world into a gray, watery mess. The wind howled, rattling the windows in their frames and tearing at the branches of the old oak tree. Martha watched, her heart pounding in her chest, as the small stream that ran alongside her property began to swell, the water turning a muddy brown. The storm intensified with terrifying speed. Lightning flashed, illuminating the landscape in brief, stark bursts, followed by deafening claps of thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. The wind screamed, carrying with it the sound of snapping branches and the ominous roar of the rising river. Martha could see debris swirling in the torrent, branches, loose boards, even a small, terrified animal struggling against the current. The rain showed no sign of letting up. The river, now a raging monster, overflowed its banks, swallowing up the lower parts of her fields. Martha watched helplessly as her carefully tended rows of vegetables disappeared beneath the churning water. The wind buffeted the house, threatening to rip the roof from its moorings. She huddled by the fireplace, the only source of warmth and light in the growing darkness, and prayed for the storm to pass. She worried about the animals, about her barn, about the very hill itself, which seemed to groan under the relentless assault of wind and rain. The storm was a force of nature, indifferent to her struggles, a reminder of her own vulnerability in the face of its raw power. The small farmhouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile boat tossed on a stormy sea. A loud knock echoed through the house, barely audible above the storm's fury. Martha hesitated. Who would be out in this weather? Cautiously, she approached the door, peering through the small, rain-streaked window. 3 figures stood huddled on her porch, their faces obscured by the downpour. She undid the latch and pulled the door open a crack. "Can we help you?" she shouted over the wind. One of the men stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered and lined. Rain streamed down his face, plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse, "we're travelers. We've lost our way in the storm. Could we trouble you for shelter?" Martha's gaze swept over the three men. They were soaked to the bone, their clothes clinging to their bodies like a second skin. She noticed the thick wool of their coats, now heavy and sodden with water. A distinct smell permeated the air, the sharp, musty odor of wet wool mixed with the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil. It was a smell she knew well, a smell of hard work and the outdoors. The second man was younger, with a friendly, open face. He shivered visibly, his teeth chattering. The third man remained silent, standing slightly behind the others, his features hidden in the shadows of his hood. He seemed the strongest of the three. "Please," the first man pleaded, "we won't be any trouble, just a place to dry off and wait out the storm." Martha looked at their faces, etched with exhaustion and cold. She thought of Thomas and how he would never turn away someone in need. Her heart softened. Despite her apprehension, she knew what she had to do. She opened the door wider. "Come in quickly," she said, gesturing them inside. "Get out of this awful weather." The wind howled in protest as she pulled the door shut behind them, shutting out the worst of the storm, but bringing a new kind of uncertainty into her solitary life. Martha ushered the men inside, her movements stiff and awkward. The small entryway suddenly felt cramped with their large frames. She gestured towards the fireplace. "Hang your coats there to dry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched as they shrugged off their heavy, waterlogged garments, the smell of wet wool intensifying in the warm air. A wave of discomfort washed over her. She hadn't had company in months, not since Thomas. The house, once filled with laughter and conversation, had grown accustomed to silence. These strangers, dripping water onto her floor and filling her space, felt like an intrusion. She busied herself, trying to regain a sense of control. "I'll make some tea," she mumbled, heading towards the kitchen. "And I think I have some stew left over from yesterday." As she moved around the familiar space, gathering wood for the stove and filling the kettle, her initial apprehension began to ease. She glanced back at the men. They were huddled near the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The younger one was still shivering, and the silent one was carefully wringing out his hat. They looked weary and grateful. The act of providing, of offering warmth and nourishment, was a familiar comfort. It reminded her of Thomas, of the countless times they had welcomed travelers into their home. She ladled the stew into bowls, adding extra vegetables from her dwindling supply. She brewed a pot of strong, black tea, its fragrant steam filling the air. When she brought the food and drinks to the men, their faces lit up with appreciation. "Thank you, ma'am," the first man said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're a lifesaver." As they ate, the silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the heavy silence of loneliness, but a comfortable quiet filled with the sounds of spoons clinking against bowls and the crackling of the fire. Martha found herself relaxing, drawn into the shared warmth and camaraderie. The storm still raged outside, but within the walls of her small farmhouse, a sense of peace began to settle. The initial discomfort had faded, replaced by a quiet satisfaction in offering kindness to those in need. She even found herself smiling, a small, tentative smile that hadn't graced her face in far too long. As the storm raged on, trapping them together in the small farmhouse, the personalities of the three men began to emerge. The first, the one who had spoken at the door, introduced himself as Silas. He was a carpenter, he explained, traveling to the next town in search of work. He spoke with a quiet confidence, his hands calloused and strong, the hands of a man used to shaping wood. He carefully examined the construction of Martha's table, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Sturdy piece," he commented, "built to last." The younger man, whose name was Thomas, like Martha's late husband, was a jovial storyteller. Despite the chill, he had a ready smile and a twinkle in his eye. He regaled Martha with tales of his travels, exaggerating the details for dramatic effect. He claimed to have once wrestled a bear, outsmarted a band of bandits, and even sailed to a faraway land filled with exotic spices. Martha chuckled at his outrageous stories, finding herself drawn into his infectious enthusiasm. The third man, the silent one, was named Jedediah. He rarely spoke, but his presence was felt nonetheless. He was a large man with a powerful build and a watchful gaze. He sat quietly by the fire, observing everything, his eyes missing nothing. Once, Martha saw him glance out the window at the raging storm, a grim expression on his face. He seemed to possess a quiet strength, a silent promise of protection. When the wind howled particularly fiercely, he would subtly shift his position, as if ready to shield them from danger. Each man contributed to the atmosphere in their own way. Silas's quiet competence provided a sense of stability. Thomas's lively stories brought laughter and lightened the mood. Jedediah's silent strength offered a feeling of security. As the hours passed, Martha found herself becoming more comfortable with their presence, appreciating their individual qualities. They were strangers, yes, but they were also kind, and in the midst of the storm, their company was a welcome comfort. She even started to anticipate Thomas's next tall tale, to value Silas's thoughtful observations, and to feel a sense of reassurance from Jedediah's quiet watchfulness. The storm outside may have been raging, but within the walls of the farmhouse, a fragile sense of camaraderie had begun to bloom. The storm raged relentlessly throughout the night, a symphony of wind and rain that seemed determined to tear the little farmhouse from its foundations. But inside, huddled around the fireplace, a different kind of story was unfolding. Martha, emboldened by the warmth of the fire and the company of her unexpected guests, began to share stories of her own. She spoke of her childhood on the farm, of the long, hot summers spent helping her father with the harvest, and the crisp, snowy winters spent sledding down the hill. She told them about Thomas, her late husband, her voice softening with love and loss as she recounted their shared dreams and the life they had built together. Silas listened intently, his gaze fixed on Martha's face, offering quiet words of comfort and understanding. Thomas, ever the entertainer, interjected with humorous anecdotes, drawing laughter from the group and gently lifting the weight of sadness that clung to Martha's memories. Even Jedediah, the silent giant, nodded occasionally, his eyes conveying a sense of empathy and shared humanity. As the night wore on, the barriers between them dissolved. They shared stories of hardship and triumph, of love and loss, of dreams both realized and abandoned. Martha learned that Silas had lost his own family to illness, that Thomas was searching for a place to call home, and that Jedediah was running from a past he couldn't outrun. They were all, in their own way, seeking solace and connection in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. The shared stories wove a tapestry of human experience, binding them together in a way that the storm outside could not unravel. The smell of wet wool mingled with the scent of wood smoke and the aroma of drying herbs, creating a comforting atmosphere of warmth and belonging. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof, once a source of anxiety, now seemed like a lullaby, a gentle reminder of the shared shelter they had found within the walls of the farmhouse. A sense of camaraderie, born from shared vulnerability and mutual respect, blossomed in the heart of the storm. They were no longer strangers, but fellow travelers on a difficult journey, united by the simple act of sharing stories and offering each other comfort in the face of adversity. Even Martha, who had long felt isolated and alone, felt a flicker of hope rekindle within her heart. The storm might rage on, but she was no longer facing it alone. As dawn approached, a pale light began to filter through the clouds, signaling the end of the storm. The wind had died down to a gentle whisper, and the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Martha, who had barely slept, watched from the window as the world slowly emerged from the darkness. The river, though still swollen, had begun to recede, leaving behind a muddy trail of debris. Silas, Thomas, and Jedediah stirred, stretching their limbs and yawning. They gathered their belongings, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. The smell of wet wool, though fainter now, still lingered in the air, a reminder of the shared experience of the night before. "Thank you, Martha," Silas said, extending his hand. His grip was firm and warm. "You saved us from a terrible night. We won't forget your kindness." Thomas, ever the optimist, clapped Martha on the shoulder. "You're a true gem, Martha. If you ever need anything at all, you just send word. We'll be there." Jedediah, as always, was more reserved, but his eyes spoke volumes. He gave Martha a nod, a silent promise of gratitude that resonated deeper than words. Martha felt a lump in her throat. She had grown surprisingly fond of these three strangers in such a short time. "You're welcome," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm just glad I could help." As the men prepared to leave, Martha offered them a loaf of bread and some cheese for their journey. They accepted gratefully, stowing the provisions in their packs. They stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the fresh, clean air after the storm. The sun was beginning to peek through the clouds, casting a golden glow on the landscape. "Safe travels," Martha called after them as they set off down the road, their figures disappearing into the mist. She stood on the porch, watching until they were out of sight, a strange mix of sadness and contentment swirling within her. The house felt empty again, but it was a different kind of emptiness. It was no longer the lonely silence of isolation, but a quiet space filled with the lingering warmth of shared stories and the promise of future connection. The storm had passed, and though the damage to her farm was evident, Martha felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she was not entirely alone. The memory of the three grateful men and the silent mathematics of favor repaid would stay with her, a beacon of light in the days to come. The months that followed were kind to Martha's farm. The sun shone brightly, the rains fell gently, and the soil, enriched by the storm's passage, yielded a bountiful harvest. Her garden flourished, overflowing with vegetables and herbs. The fields, once scarred by the floodwaters, were now lush and green, swaying gently in the breeze. Martha worked tirelessly, her heart filled with gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose. The memory of Silas, Thomas, and Jedediah and their promise to return the favor spurred her on, giving her the strength to overcome the lingering challenges. But the weather, as always, was fickle. As autumn approached, the gentle rains turned relentless. Day after day, the skies wept, soaking the earth and filling the river to its banks. The ground became saturated, soft, and unstable beneath her feet. Martha watched with growing anxiety as the hillside, already weakened by the previous storm, began to show signs of strain. Small cracks appeared in the soil, widening with each passing day. The trees, their roots loosened by the constant rain, leaned precariously, their branches heavy with water. The air hung thick and heavy, laden with moisture. The smell of damp earth permeated everything, a constant reminder of the impending danger. Martha tried to reinforce the lower fields, building makeshift barriers to divert the water, but it was a losing battle. The hillside was slowly but surely giving way. She knew that if the rains continued, a landslide was inevitable. Her home, her livelihood, everything she had worked so hard to rebuild, would be swept away in a torrent of mud and debris. The fear that she had carried for so long, the fear of losing everything to the unforgiving weather, was now a tangible presence, a dark cloud looming over her farm. She thought of Silas, Thomas, and Jedediah and their promise to return. Would they remember her? Would they come back in time to help? Or would she be left to face this new threat alone, watching helplessly as her world crumbled around her? The soil under her feet felt treacherous, unreliable, a constant reminder of the power of nature and the fragility of her existence. The landslide began with a low rumble, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. Martha, who had been anxiously watching the hillside from her window, felt a shiver run down her spine. It was a sound she had dreaded, a sound that signaled the beginning of the end. The rumble grew louder, escalating into a deafening roar as the earth began to shift and groan. A section of the hillside, weakened by weeks of relentless rain, broke away with a sickening crack. Trees, their roots no longer able to hold them in place, toppled like dominoes, their branches flailing wildly as they crashed to the ground. A torrent of mud and debris surged downwards, sweeping away everything in its path. Martha watched in horror as her carefully tended fields disappeared beneath the churning mass of earth and vegetation. The sound was terrifying, the roar of the landslide, the snapping of trees, the gurgling of mud, all blending together into a cacophony of destruction. The landslide advanced relentlessly, threatening to engulf her home. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she could feel the vibrations of the earth giving way. Cracks spiderwebbed across the walls of her house, and the windows rattled in their frames. She knew that it was only a matter of time before her home, her sanctuary, would be swallowed up by the relentless force of nature. Tears streamed down Martha's face as she watched her life's work being destroyed before her eyes. The garden she had nurtured, the fields she had toiled over, the home she had shared with Thomas, all were being taken away by the unforgiving earth. The smell of wet soil was overpowering, a suffocating reminder of the power of nature and her own helplessness. Just as she was about to abandon all hope, she heard another sound, a sound that cut through the roar of the landslide, the sound of voices calling her name. She peered through the rain-streaked window, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. And then she saw them, three familiar figures struggling up the muddy hillside, their faces determined, their eyes fixed on her. It was Silas, Thomas, and Jedediah, and they had not forgotten their promise. They were back and they were ready to fight. Silas, Thomas, and Jedediah had been traveling through the region when they saw the ominous dark clouds gathering on the horizon. They remembered Martha's farm, perched precariously on the hillside, and a sense of foreboding settled over them. They knew that another storm like the one they had weathered together could spell disaster for her. They quickened their pace, their hearts pounding with anxiety. As they neared Martha's farm, they saw the devastation, the muddy scars of the landslide tearing through the fields, the toppled trees, the ominous cracks in the earth. They knew that Martha was in grave danger. Without hesitation, they scrambled up the slippery hillside, their boots sinking into the mud. They called out Martha's name, their voices barely audible above the roar of the landslide and the pounding rain. When they finally saw her at the window, her face etched with despair, their determination grew even stronger. They knew that they had to act quickly if they were going to save her farm and her home. The memory of Martha's kindness, her warmth, and her generosity during the storm months ago fueled their resolve. They remembered the taste of her stew, the warmth of her fire, the comfort of her stories. They remembered her unwavering spirit, her connection to the land, and her quiet strength. They knew that Martha had offered them shelter when they were lost and vulnerable, and now it was their turn to repay the favor. They had come to her aid not out of obligation, but out of a deep sense of gratitude and respect. They understood the silent mathematics of favor repaid, the unspoken bond that connected them to Martha and to the land. Silas, the carpenter, immediately assessed the situation, his mind already working on a plan to reinforce the hillside. Thomas, the storyteller, rallied his spirits, determined to bring hope and encouragement to Martha's heart. Jedediah, the silent giant, stood ready to lend his strength and his unwavering support. They were three men facing a force of nature, but they were united by a common purpose: to repay Martha's kindness and to help her save her home. They had come back not just to fulfill a promise, but to stand by a friend in need. They knew that the task ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but they were ready to face it together, armed with their tools, their sweat, and their unwavering determination. The memory of the wet wool coats drying by Martha's fire was now a symbol of the bond they shared. Silas, with his carpenter's eye, quickly devised a plan to build retaining walls to stabilize the hillside and divert the flow of water. Thomas, with his gift for gab, set off to rally the neighbors, spreading the word of Martha's plight and appealing to their sense of community. Jedediah, with his quiet strength, began clearing debris and preparing the ground for the retaining walls. Soon other neighbors arrived, their faces grim but determined. They brought shovels, axes, and wheelbarrows, their boots sinking into the mud as they joined the effort. Men and women, young and old, worked side by side, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The air filled with the sounds of hammering, sawing, and the rhythmic thud of shovels digging into the earth. The work was backbreaking, demanding every ounce of strength and endurance. The rain continued to fall, soaking them to the bone and turning the ground into a slippery quagmire. Mud splattered their faces and clothes, but they kept working, driven by a shared sense of purpose and a desire to help Martha. Silas directed the construction of the retaining walls, his knowledge of carpentry proving invaluable. He showed them how to interlock the logs, how to brace them against the hillside, and how to create a sturdy barrier against the relentless force of the landslide. Jedediah, with his immense strength, lifted heavy logs and boulders, placing them with precision and reinforcing the walls. Thomas, despite his lack of building experience, worked tirelessly, hauling materials, encouraging his fellow workers, and keeping their spirits high with his jokes and stories. Martha, watching from her window, was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Tears streamed down her face as she witnessed the community coming together to save her farm. She knew that she could never repay their kindness, but she vowed to dedicate her life to helping others in need. As the sun began to set, the retaining walls were nearing completion. They were not perfect, but they were strong, a testament to the power of human collaboration and the unwavering spirit of the community. The water, diverted by the walls, began to flow away from the house and the remaining fields, easing the pressure on the hillside. The workers, exhausted but satisfied, gathered around the fire that Martha had managed to light in her hearth. They were covered in mud, their clothes torn, their hands blistered, but their faces were beaming with pride. They had faced the threat of the landslide together, and they had prevailed. The silent mathematics of favor repaid had transformed into a symphony of shared labor and community spirit. In the days that followed, the rain finally ceased, and the sun emerged, casting a warm glow upon the mended earth. The landslide had left its mark, a scar upon the hillside, but the retaining walls stood strong, a testament to the community's resilience and determination. The fields, though damaged, were not destroyed. Martha, with the help of her neighbors, began the slow process of rebuilding. They cleared debris, replanted crops, and nursed the land back to life. The soil, churned and aerated by the landslide, was surprisingly fertile. New shoots emerged, vibrant and green, promising a bountiful harvest. The air was filled with the scent of fresh soil, a rich, earthy aroma that mingled with the sweet fragrance of wildflowers that had sprung up in the newly disturbed earth. It was a smell of hope, of renewal, of life springing forth from the ashes of destruction. As Martha worked in her garden, she would often catch a faint whiff of something else, a familiar scent that brought a smile to her face, the lingering memory of wet wool. It was a subtle reminder of the storm, of the three strangers who had sought shelter in her home, and of the bond that had been forged between them. The memory of that night, the shared stories, the warmth of the fire, and the gratitude that had passed between them was now intertwined with the very fabric of her farm. The scent of wet wool was a symbol of kindness, of generosity, and of the silent mathematics of favor repaid. The hillside was still scarred, but it was also stronger, reinforced by the retaining walls and by the unwavering spirit of the community. The farm was still vulnerable, but it was also more resilient, nurtured by the love and labor of those who had come to its aid. Martha knew that the weather would always be a threat, but she no longer feared it as she once had. She had learned that even in the face of devastation, there was hope, that even in the darkest of storms, there was light. She had learned that the strength of community, the power of kindness, and the silent mathematics of favor repaid could overcome even the most formidable challenges. And as she looked out over her mended earth, she knew that her farm, like her spirit, would continue to thrive, nourished by the rich soil, the warm sun, and the enduring bonds of human connection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Martha sat on her porch, watching Silas, Thomas, and Jedediah as they prepared to leave. The retaining walls were complete, the fields were replanted, and the threat of the landslide had passed. They had done all they could. Martha rose and approached them, her heart overflowing with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my farm, my home, my life. I can never repay you for what you've done." Silas smiled gently. "You don't have to, Martha. We were just repaying a debt. You gave us shelter when we needed it most." Thomas clapped her on the shoulder. "Besides, Martha, you're part of the community now. We look out for each other." Jedediah simply nodded, his eyes conveying a depth of feeling that words could not express. Martha looked at their faces, etched with weariness but also with satisfaction. She realized then that their repayment had gone far beyond the simple act of providing shelter. They had given her something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of hope. They had reminded her that she was not alone, that there were people who cared about her, people who were willing to stand by her side in times of trouble. They had shown her the true meaning of kindness, of generosity, and of the silent mathematics of favor repaid. "I understand now," she said, her voice filled with awe. "It wasn't just about repaying a debt. It was about something much bigger, something much deeper." As Silas, Thomas, and Jedediah walked down the road, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun, Martha felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. The storm had passed, the landslide had been averted, and her farm was safe. But more importantly, her heart was full. She knew that the future would hold challenges, that the weather would always be unpredictable, and that life would not always be easy. But she also knew that she was not alone, that she had a community to support her, and that the bonds of human connection could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. As she looked out over her mended earth, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Martha smiled. The scent of fresh soil mingled with the lingering memory of wet wool, a reminder of the storm, the strangers, and the enduring power of kindness and community. The silent mathematics of favor repaid had transformed her life, filling it with hope, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. The story of Martha's farm, once a tale of solitude and vulnerability, had become a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of community.